is Grandstream's new audio conferencing solution. I will go again more into this in depth in a few more slides. So this is just kind of the basic functionality and basic build of the GBC 3200, just so you can kind of get an idea and a gauge of, you know, its capabilities and really what it's made from. So getting started. So basically it's easy to install. So it comes with a GAC 2500 and it also comes with all the power supplies and everything that you need. So it's really as simple as plugging it in and linking in the GAC 2500 if you want it.
So here we are live.
Like to stress, the GAC 2500
Can we open the show?
come with the GBC. However, depending on the
I've been here for more than
you were using this, sometimes
an hour and a
you
half.
don't even need the GAC 2500
because I was told that my time I live in Venezuela,
is quite
and I was told that
so I will just
your time was equivalent to 6 o'clock
kind of a
here in the
larger
morning.
boardroom.
And
you know,
of
if you're in a
course,
small office,
I joined very early. It was hard for me because this is the first time I used the web or WebEx.
It's easy to get started.
I didn't know how to use it,
mention here
and I had to learn
I won't
last
go too
night.
much into our IP video talk
this morning,
but
I was fighting to get in, but it was because it was closed.
Some of you might have seen that we released our first cloud solution.
I'm here.
I
got it tuned up.
This is
and I'm willing to
conferencing solution.
Yes, I'm Francisco Taran.
Use this.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. We are really looking forward to host you. So we shall start our show with Ifra, who's going to introduce all of us right now, especially our organization, and then we will go turn-wise. Is that all right, sir?
If it is of interest to you as well.
Perfect.
And then also easy
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Basically, you can use any third-party SIP platform, and you can, like I said,
thank you. So good afternoon to one and all present here, and a very warm welcome to each one of you who joined us today.
So here we go with the easy
So as we all know, today is International Human Rights Day, and on behalf of Red Lantern Analytica, we are observing International Human Rights Day, and we're very privileged to have amongst us eminent scholars from across the globe. Red Lantern Analytica is an international affairs observer group that is based out of New Delhi, India. It focuses on critical issues that are related to China, with special focus on Sino-India relations, issues of national and international security, energy and environment. The main aim of our organization is to draw in India's foremost academic institutions and security intelligentsia, corporate institutions, monetary establishments, and experts in discussion on India's foreign policy and the extent the country's role in global issues. To maximize the institutional and scholarly capacity of strategic thinking in India, we are required to integrate expertise in our research in order to foster an even-minded international strategy in India. This is a young organization that is in constant search for fresh ideas and thoughts in the strategic studies discourse. With this goal in mind, we have set up ourselves as an autonomous and a solitary international strategy think tank. We are an intellectual startup functioning with a small number of individuals who are passionate about international affairs. So to moderate this session, we have Ms. Sriyoshi Sinha, who is a research scholar from Jamia Millia Islamia University, India. Now I would request Ms. Sriyoshi to take over the further session.
Thank you so much, Ifra, for this generous introduction of the organization and also of myself. Today we are going to celebrate the International Human Rights Day. And what do we mean by human rights? Human rights describe moral norms or moral standards which are understood as inalienable fundamental rights of every human person. Human rights encompass a wide variety of rights, including but not limited to the right to life, to a healthy environment, to a fair trial, to protection of physical integrity, protection against enslavement, the right to free speech, the right to education, etc. The protection of human rights is certainly one of the most important aspects of development. Nevertheless, it receives much less attention than other aspects of the society, presumably in part because it is so very hard to measure human rights. Probably this is why the world is going through a very rough phase right now, where basic human rights are in a state of absolute dilemma. And this year, when we speak of specific human rights violations and situations of concerns in countries, the states that are made repeated references to are, of course, China, Afghanistan, large parts of West Asia, Libya, Syria, Myanmar, Crimea, the Sahel, Yemen, Iran, Ethiopia, and Haiti. With the recent withdrawal from Afghanistan by the United States and the taking over by the Taliban, the human rights issues within this country took a center stage. It was mentioned a few times that the Syrian conflict has been going on for a decade and that states were divided about the best solution to the conflict. Also, many emphasized the need to support Haiti after recent natural disasters and political turmoil. Human rights violations are immensely regressive in countries like China, where authorities detain and prosecute numerous citizens on a daily basis for their online posts, for private chat messages, or for anything that is related to freedom of speech and expression. The government continues to crack down on Chinese users of Twitter, which is already blocked in China. It was revealed in January that a mainland student at the University of Minnesota was sentenced to 6 months in prison in November 2019 for tweets critical of President Xi he posted when he was in the US. In terms of religion as well, the Chinese government's effort to sinicize religion, which aimed to ensure that the Chinese Communist Party is the arbiter of people's spiritual life, continued in 2020. The oppression of Uyghurs are also not unknown. Additionally, China's role in spreading the pandemic, on the other hand, we have also seen how it has played a very critical role in spreading and not preventing the spread of the pandemic. On the other side, we have also seen the case of Bangladesh, where the minority community has been brutally killed, maimed, raped, and whatnot. These are numerous examples of human rights violations across the world. The incidents are so intense that it's time to reawaken our dead conscience. With this view in mind, Red Lantern Analytica is observing the International Human Rights Day this year with some excellent speakers as a part of our panel on human rights and global peace. Thank you to all the respected panelists who have taken out time from the very busy schedule to join us tonight. I hope we shall have a very enriching session ahead that would clear our views on the issues of human rights and enlighten us more on this very relevant topic. So our first speaker tonight is Dr. Satoru Nagao. I hope I have pronounced your name correctly, sir. If not, pardon me. Who is a fellow at the Hudson Institute based in Tokyo, Japan. From December 2017 through November 2020, he was a visiting fellow at the Institute based in Washington, D.C. Dr. Nagao's primary research area is US-Japan-India security cooperation. He was awarded his PhD by the Gakushuen University in 2011 for his thesis, India's Military Strategy, the first such research thesis on this topic in Japan. His university is a premier institution from which members of the Japanese imperial family have also graduated. Over to you, sir. Thank you.
It is honor for me to make presentation in this place. Indeed, unfortunately, I'm a security researcher, so human rights issues are out of range originally. But when we check China's behavior, we can understand how important the bio-related issues, including human rights. So my view is came from the security researcher, but it is related with the human rights issue. So simply said, if other countries believe that non-democratic China is a model of success, the democratic countries will increasingly lose influence in the future. So we must step up our effort to promote democratic norms and values in its relation with China. So I will explain why can I say so from now. Indeed, China has undertaken a large number of aggressive military operations throughout the Indo-Pacific region, including East China Sea, Taiwan, South China Sea, Indo-China border area, and the Indian Ocean. Of course, in the India-China border area, the 20 brave Indian soldiers sacrificed their lives. So why China is provoking us and what should we do? With regard to China's motivation, there is similarities between East China Sea, Taiwan, South China Sea, the Indo-China border area, and the Indian Ocean. Examining these similarities help us to contextualize China's actions. So, three important similarities. First one is China's similarity of the note is China's repeated disregard for the international law when laying claim to new territories. In the East China Sea, China did not claim the Senkaku Island before the 1970s. China's attitude has since changed due to the potential existence of oil reserve in the East China Sea. So now Chinese Coast Guard ship enters Japan's territorial waters repeatedly, especially the sea around Senkaku Island, and pass Japanese fishing boats, etc., in this area. So the non-observance of this international border further demonstrates China's attitude of territorial entitlement and disrespect for the international law. In the South China Sea, the Permanent Court of Arbitration at The Hague rejected China's claim to sovereignty over much of the South China Sea in 2016. Despite this, China continues to claim and occupy the area, and China is expressing the same attitude at the Indo-China border. In this case, Dr. Robson Sanger, the president of the Tibetan Exile Administration at that time, expressed that Dalai Lama considers the disputed territories of both Ladakh and Arunachal Pradesh to be part of India. So thus, there is a high possibility that China's claim to the area along the Indo-China border area is legally baseless. Despite this, China claimed it. Secondly, the China's repeated disregard for the benefit of the recipient and create huge debate. Because of the sheer size of the China's investment and the 60 to 8% of the interest rate it's charged on loans, these countries now have the enormous debate. So World Bank and the Asian Development Bank, in contrast, charge 0.25 to the 3% interest rate. So China is 6 to 8%. It's crazy level. In addition, China has started to deploy missiles and military planes on the island in the South China Sea, despite insisting they have no military purpose. Indeed, this was same pattern China followed when it set up the military base in Djibouti. So every time China breaks a promise. And this is high interest rate, it creates a huge debate for the recipient. Thirdly, this is related to the human rights. China's repeated disregard for the human rights and environment restriction to produce cheap products and destroy the local industries in other countries. For example, the China dominates rare earths to develop high technologies. How? Because China can ignore the environment restrictions, their mining cost was very cheap. And in January 2021, the US State Secretary Pompeo determined that China's atrocity in Xinjiang was genocide. The Biden administration has also repeatedly mentioned that what China has done there amounts to just genocide. So in this case, one of the problems is forceful labor in Xinjiang. If China ignores the human rights and uses forceful labor, the cost of the product is cheap too. So there's a concern that number of the democratic countries worldwide has been declining now. According to the Freedom House, the number of the free countries declined from 89 in 2005 to 82 in 2020. And the number of not free countries increased from 45 to 54. If other countries believe that non-democratic China is a model for success, that the democratic countries will increasingly lose influence in the future. Therefore, we, especially India, world's largest democracy, and the US, Japan, Australia, and others, must step up our effort to promote democratic norms and values in its relation with China. That's what I want to say today. Thank you very much. Should I say something more?
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Can we move on to our next speaker now, Mr. Michael Jones? I'll just, yeah. So thank you so much, Dr. Nagao, for your wonderful speech. Our next speaker is Mr. Michael Jones, who is a leading US foreign policy expert and has served previously as a White House presidential speechwriter to President George W. Bush, and as a senior aide in the United States Senate, and to former New Jersey Governor and 9/11 Commission Chairman Thomas Keane. As a Heritage Foundation foreign policy analyst, Michael was a leading architect and proponent of the Reagan Doctrine of support for global political and insurgency movements confronting Soviet-backed communist regimes, including the resistant forces of Ahmed Shah Massoud in Afghanistan, which is widely credited with helping end the Cold War without direct US military intervention. After the end of the Cold War, Michael ran global program development for the International Republican Institute, a non-governmental organization supported by the US government that assists non-democratic nations and developing democracies with organizing and implementing democratic institutions, developing constitutions that protect individual rights, expanding women's and indigenous people's rights, and planning and holding free and fair elections. He has also worked in countries throughout Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the former Soviet Union, including in Kuwait and Turkey. Over to you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate Red Lantern taking some time today to commemorate this anniversary of 1948, the signing of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which it's important to remember is not a binding agreement on the countries that have signed it. And that's pretty abundantly clear because a good number of its signatories are some of the most egregious violators of human rights today. And I certainly would echo all of the concerns that were just mentioned about China's Communist Party, which I think stands out as probably the leading immediate concern that we have. What I think we need to maybe utilize today to remind ourselves on the importance of human rights, and they have a very critical role in American and in all countries' diplomacy. And we've sometimes, I think, struggled to define what role that is. I mean, how important are they? Are they the singular, factor in our relationship with countries of the world? Are they a non-existent factor? It seems to me also that we've wrestled in many ways with approaches that have and have not worked as it relates to human rights. I think I start with basically the tenets of understanding that the rights of men and women on planet Earth, as was sort of laid out by our founders in the United States of America, are not bestowed on it by government. They are bestowed on it by God, and they are thus rights that are inherent to those individuals. And the function of our government here and elsewhere around the world should be to functionally defend those rights that are inherently granted to individuals on the birth. And clearly, when you look at today and you consider 1948 to 2021 as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights brought an end to these human rights atrocities, obviously signed 1948 after the Holocaust. It's utterly shocking to me to go through the significant litany of late 20th century and early 21st century atrocities and human rights violations that have been enormously egregious, and one could argue largely preventable, had the free nations of the world bonded and addressed them with the great seriousness that they deserve. I do think that the UN, I'm not an advocate, as some fellow conservatives are, of leaving the UN, though I did feel that former President Trump's decision to leave the UN Human Rights Council was advisable. I mean, you simply cannot have countries of the world that are the most egregious violators of human rights standing in judgment basically of free nations and utilizing their functional role to deflect from the obvious concerns that exist in their own countries. Yet that's been essentially the habit that has, the UN has fallen into. UN has a lot of work to do. As a leading funder of the UN, the United States has, I think, a crucial role in trying to bring those reforms into place. But I think it would be foolish for us to feel that human rights are going to be guided and protected on an international basis by this body. Their long history of mismanagement on these issues is as remarkable as the positive things they've done, and it's a mixed story of some successes and some failures. Let me start with the Uyghurs, because genocide is as serious of a word as it gets, as I've said, in geopolitics. We're coming up on the first anniversary since the United States government formally designated China's Communist Party as being engaged in genocidal behavior in Xinjiang, or East Turkestan, as the Uyghurs often refer to it. This is documentally and factually true. As it was the case with the Holocaust, I think we've been slow to recognize it. And frankly, the action that's been taken since the declaration of genocide is enormously troubling to me, almost as troubling as the genocide itself, in the sense that the one thing that we rest on, that we hope for, is that when we have these regimes that emerge that have such callous disregard for human life and will put the protection of their own self-interest and powers above any other consideration, even to the extent of eliminating an entire ethnic group, as is the case in communist China, which, by the way, is, you're talking about the largest number of innocent individuals killed for this creation of this perverse system, tens of millions, exceeding that of Stalin and Hitler, all the way back to Mao. It's in their DNA, sadly. And I've mentioned recently, I don't know why we haven't been clear in doing this long ago, that, to the extent we confronted the evil empire in this former Soviet Union, which I believe we did, China's Communist Party is in many ways even a broader and deeper evilness that we confront. And I do think it's not a cliche to mention that when we talk about these human rights concerns that exist in every country of the world, and they exist in our own countries, even in the United States, when we're confronting issues that we need to address, that the underlying conflict is one of good versus evil. And in the case of China's Communist Party, you go through the actions that they've taken. Let me just give you one. I mean, they're engaged, as I think is widely known now, in a broad global criminal syndicate, selling some of the most dangerous and deadly drugs for profit, also involved in the human transplant marketplace for profit. Imagine just the mindset of a regime that would remove the organ of a dissident without anesthesia for the purposes of profit. This is horrifying reality. And in a year that we've had now to address this, for us to be sitting around negotiating and debating over participation in the Olympics, which is in no way equivalent recourse for this, is an absurdity. The first priority needs to be today to end the genocide. We end the genocide by gaining entry into the Uyghur camps. And China's Communist Party is obligated to provide that entry under numerous agreements and numerous international commitments that it's made. So, where is the pressure being exerted, and where are the voices of sensibility, reason, and even rule of law on these issues? So, the first thing we want to do is save these lives. There's got to be a punitive dimension to this, but I almost feel like that's after we've addressed this. I mean, we dealt with punitive measures on the Holocaust after we liberated the concentration camps. And I would suggest that today that's got to be the unifying message of anyone who's concerned about human life, that we have 2 to 3 million estimated Uyghurs in concentration camps, and a vulnerable population considerably greater than that. It's having its rights destroyed. Hong Kong, enormously concerning. The underlying agreement for Hong Kong's independence, which I had grave concerns about. I can recall I was just getting active in foreign policy back then. But the defense of Margaret Thatcher's decision basically was that the CCP had said you can get into this agreement, or we can go take Hong Kong militarily in 48 hours. That's another product and recognition that we need to come to grips with, is that we have facilitated the rise of China's Communist Party as a military force, a global military force, doing great harm now around the world, and particularly in the Asia-Pacific region and in the South China Sea. And we've empowered them economically in ways that have not gone at all like the sinologists in the West predicted. We were always told that the favorable trade relations we had with China would develop a middle class in the country, that would increase pressure on the government to liberalize, and that ultimately China's economic success was something that would be consistent with the interests of Western democracies. It's certainly not been the case. We've seen a complete opposite of that, meaning that as China's economic ascent has developed, they've become more belligerent, and they've utilized the leverage that we've granted them against us. We see that in COVID, where they did not allow in inspectors there either. They lied to the World Health Organization. Their fingerprints are all over this pandemic, which almost certainly stemmed from the Wuhan Institute of Virology, as part of their ongoing military program in the development of biological warfare. And then I wanted, so we have the issues on China. Number one, we need to gain entry to the camps. We need to liberate the camps. Whether we participate fully, wholly, or a little bit in the Olympics is almost irrelevant. That doesn't save these lives. Then we ultimately are in a punitive phase where we've got to talk about holding the CCP accountable for the damage they've done economically and to human life around the world through the release of COVID, and also the remedy for the Uyghurs. I'm enormously concerned right now that we would issue the declaration of genocide on communist China and now be in a point where we're not following it up with really the degree of seriousness that's required. I mean, the purpose in labeling, utilizing that phrase, genocide, that word genocide, is to open up the opportunity to take the sort of steps to bring it to an end. So we have work to do with the Uyghurs. We have work to do with Hong Kong. All of China, I think you can look at, as was the case in the Soviet Union, really an unnatural empire being held together by force. Individuals in these provinces are having their cultures, their languages, their history, their individual ethnicity completely disrespected and stomped upon. in the name of Xi Jinping, the president for life's, vision of what 1.4 billion people should be doing. The good news is 1.4 billion people do not support the direction of that country, and it's being run by, in essence, a very small number of people, under 1,000 people probably, ultimately making the key decisions for 1.4 billion people who stand against it. And so in Hong Kong, I mean, we really owe those students a great degree of praise and recognition for their work. They deserve to be remembered today and supported. And then just some final words on Afghanistan. There is no Taliban 2.0, and there is no basis. Somebody needs to put on their mute button there, if you could. Thank you. Let me just wrap this up on Afghanistan. On Afghanistan, firstly, very disappointed with the Biden administration's handling of this. I've written extensively on it. I think this was planned design. I think there's a good chance that China was very influential in essentially demanding this rapid, irrational departure, which made no sense. It was a series of decisions all the way going back to July with the air base and an absolute surrender that's put many lives in danger now. Good news is only, I think, 3 countries have recognized the Taliban: Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and the UAE. The UN itself, even to its credit, has put out some grave reservations about the direction of things. I say that the position that we need to take today, as we look at human rights, is the Afghan Constitution, which was signed and it was assembled by over 500 men and women who deliberated on this great effort. And it includes a provision that I think all should read. I've cited it several times. This is not taking off, I should say, as a position, but I believe, we simply cannot dismiss this. Article 67, Afghan Constitution, addresses exactly what should be done in this situation in case of resignation, or death of the president, as well as an incurable illness impeding performance of duty. The first vice president shall assume authorities and duties of the president, followed by, on an interim basis, until elections could be held. Now, this Article 67 was not written for smooth sailing waters. It was written precisely for a moment like this. The interim vice president, Saleh, needs to be recognized as the interim president by countries of the world and by multinational bodies in accordance with the will of the Afghan people in this constitution. And then we have, the process through elections. Difficult to imagine when you have this terrorist movement with guns in the street, and clearly the disarmament of the Taliban is part of that. But as negative as things have gone in Afghanistan since August and even earlier, and my inquiries and the calls that I get are frantic in nature, of Afghans looking to get out, and Afghans that I have attempted to get out who have been killed by the Taliban over the last few months in arbitrary killings of individuals who are suspected opponents or had some loose affiliation with the United States during our 20-year engagement in that conflict. It's inexcusable. And they're in prohibiting humanitarian assistance in the Panjshir Valley, which is an international crime, needs to be taken seriously. And so I believe what we're missing is the voice of strong voices of leadership on this issue. And the only thing it is positive is that you're not seeing the world rushing to align themselves with the Taliban or acknowledge this. And the 3 countries that did are all countries we have, formidable relationships with. I think we should be exerting that influence to retract it. The final point is, I mentioned the limitations of the UN. The UN has played some very constructive roles since the UN has played some very constructive roles since its founding. The US was very involved, obviously, in its founding, but there are inherent limitations. I think when you've got, I looked just the last Freedom House report, human rights report, looked at sort of the top 100 countries of the world from a population basis. 34 declared not free. So a third, really, or roughly, of UN membership are countries that themselves do not have established democratic political systems or respect for human rights, or even the construct legally and otherwise to provide for that. In the case of China, as has been pointed out, all the authority lies in the hands of China's Communist Party. The legal system entirely in their hands, the military completely in their hands, the regional provincial governance all in their hands, and now a president never elected by anyone, never elected by 1.4 billion people, representing really this small group of thuggish individuals, really, that have been properly labeled genocidal. So many human rights concerns around the world, and the UN, I think, has that limitation. But my final point would be that we have countries and individuals of goodwill. This call is a great example of that. And our voices and our influence will gain considerable ground as we unify and make these points, because ultimately policymakers are responsive to logic and to the number of voices that come behind that logic. That's the opportunity that I think exists for us in this defining moment for human rights around the world on this anniversary of the 1948 signing of the UN Human Rights Declaration. Thanks.
That was a wonderful presentation, Mr. Johns. Thank you. It's really worth hearing you every time we do rather. And about China, starting from their curtails on internet issues to cynicizing religions to spreading of immense number of diseases, we do not know where they will ultimately go and stop. Starting from Hong Kong to Taiwan to Tibet to Manchuria, we do not know. China's greed is increasing day by day, and we really need to think something very serious. With that in mind, I'm going on to the next eminent speaker, Mr. Marc Fenod. So Mr. Marc Fenod is a former French diplomat who was seconded to the GCSP from 2004 to 2013 and is now a staff member at the GCSP. Mr. Fenod leads activities related to arms proliferation. He finished secondary school in Marseille, I do not know if I'm pronouncing it correctly or not, in 1970 and in Independence, Iowa, USA in 1971. He holds the Certificate of Proficiency in English of the University of Cambridge, Great Britain, as well as a master's degree in international law from the University of Aix-en-Provence, France, and he is a graduate of the Paris Institute of Political Studies. He joined the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 1977, first at the Military Cooperation Division. In 1977 till 1978, he was the Vice Consul at the French Consulate General in Leningrad, USSR. Back in Paris, he worked at the Directorate for Europe, Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, that is CESCE, from 1979 till 1982. He was a member of the French delegation to the CESCE meeting in Madrid from 1980 to 1982. In 1982 to 1983, he served as the Chief of Staff of the Secretary General of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs before being appointed First Secretary at the French Embassy in Warsaw. In 1987 to 1988, he was the Secretary General of the French delegation to the CSCE meeting in Vienna. Lots of achievements, sir. We will hear something different from sir. We will hear about how there is human rights violations in terms of nuclear proliferation and no disarmament. Over to you, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sreoshi, for this nice introduction and for the invitation, the kind invitation. If I may, I would like to share a short PowerPoint presentation to have some ideas about yes. So talking about human rights and disarmament or arms proliferation, how weapons affect actually all human rights, how we can distinguish the importance of human rights and humanitarian law, nuclear weapons and sustainable development goals, because development is one of the key human rights, and a few takeaways. So if you look at the UN Charter, there is a key article which is very often forgotten. It's about the mandate of the Security Council. And the Security Council is mandated to establish a system of regulation of armaments in order to promote the establishment and maintenance of peace and security with the least diversion for armaments of the world's human and economic resources. So this is one of the key goals of the United Nations. And even if the Security Council didn't really fulfill this mandate, actually this objective was reached by other UN organs or international institutions. And then it's clear that if you look at excessive arms buildup and proliferation, and it practically violate every human rights proclaimed in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Article 1. Article 2, because then there is a distinction of states which are overly armed versus those that are victims of armament. And then there's, of course, the key reference to the right to life, liberty, and security of person. These are three key human rights which would be affected, of course, by the spread of and proliferation of weapons, of the uncontrolled use of all categories of weapons. Equality, equal protection of the law. Again, you may have, you may be in a system where you are threatened by arms possessed by the government, the police, the army, or individuals, terrorists, criminal groups. Arbitrary arrest and detention, the same. Right, freedom of movement, right to return, to leave a country and to return to a country. I mean, look at, we talked about Uyghurs, but talk about other minority groups or people who are under occupation or in huge concentration camps like the Gaza Strip being shelled by Israeli weapons. Freedom of thought and conscience and religion, again, can be affected if they are held by minorities which are persecuted by governments or armed groups. The same with freedom of opinion or expression, freedom of peaceful assembly or association. This is a crucial right for NGOs, for whistleblowers that can call on public opinion to look at the disasters caused by arms proliferation, nuclear testing, for instance, on humanity or the environment. Everyone has a right to equal access to public service, but again, this can be limited, violated by the spread of small arms and light weapons, for instance. Same with standard of living, good health, well-being, right to job security. All these can be affected if you live in a country, for instance, which has been in conflict, where you have lots of unexploded remnants of war, landmines, cluster munitions, etc. This can affect all your living conditions. Social and international order And again, this is important to recall that these rights and freedoms in the declaration have to be fully realized within this international order. And the only limitations to rights and freedoms should be justified only by respect for the rights of others and public order and general welfare. Key importance, obviously, to the right to life. And I really draw your attention to a recent comment by the Human Rights Committee. It's not the Human Rights Council, but it's an important organ within the UN because it's composed of independent experts who are not, subject to government pressures. They actually interpret the law, international law, especially the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And there's an important Article 6 on the right to life in this covenant, and this is what they wrote in 2018, that the threat or use of weapons of mass destruction, particularly nuclear weapons, which are indiscriminate and cause human destruction on a catastrophic scale, is incompatible with respect for the right to life and may amount to a crime under international law. So this is, again, a fundamental recognition that nuclear weapons, if they were used or even if they are threatened, as is the case today, can be a crime in international law. So we know that in the Cold War, the main focus was on national security, state security, because conflicts were mostly between states, and arms control instruments had as purpose to channel, to control the arms race, to achieve military balance and lower the risk of wars. And so the key actors were the state. Since the end of the Cold War, the focus is more on human security, internal conflicts, because civilians are the main victims of internal conflicts, and therefore there has to be a new paradigm, which is called the humanitarian paradigm of disarmament. And the main objective is to protect civilians, non-combatants in armed conflict. And civil society then plays a major role in initiating all these agreements that we have seen in recent years. Now, we have to be aware, of course, that during international conflict, armed conflict, or non-international armed conflict, international humanitarian law protecting civilians applies, and also international human rights law. So the only situation when IHL doesn't apply is peaceful situations, but human rights law applies all the time, either in peace or in armed conflict. And thanks to this focus on the humanitarian paradigm, there's been a major series of achievements, in these arms control disarmament treaties, culminating on the treaty with the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which has the same objective, to protect civilians from armed conflict. And now, what about these sustainable development goals? Because again, development is a major human right, and this program, this Agenda 2030, really encapsulates all the goals that would be affected by the use or threat of use of nuclear weapons. No poverty, and as we know, the military spending is almost $2 trillion, $2,000 billion. That's almost 2.5% of global GDP. Obviously, this includes major shares for nuclear weapons. At the same time, assistance to developing countries is merely 10% of this sum for military spending. The objective of zero hunger. We know that if only a few nuclear weapons would be used, this would cause a nuclear winter and famine of 2 billion people. good health, well-being. Look at the budget of the WHO, which has been so necessary now to deal with the pandemics. It is covered by 1.5 days of military spending. Quality education, that we see that nuclear weapons companies actually fund think tanks. Gender equalities, obviously women and girls suffer more than the effects of nuclear weapons or nuclear testing. Clean water and sanitation, any use of nuclear weapons would destroy all infrastructure. Clean and affordable energy. Nuclear energy is now even considered as a possible response to climate change, but we know that there are the problems with nuclear waste, nuclear proliferation, and higher cost than renewable energies. Decent work, economic growth. It was shocking to hear that during the pandemic, at the same time when world GDP shrank by 4.4%, military spending increased by 2.6%. Industry, infrastructure, the resources that are engulfed in nuclear weapons, of course, do not benefit other economic and social needs. Reduced inequalities. Now we have this, double standard system or two-tier system between the nuclear armed states and the non-nuclear armed states, which are, of course, considered as less powerful with a less prestige, less capacity to affect the world security. Sustainable cities. Cities would be the most affected by any use of nuclear weapons. They are the main targets. Responsible production and consumption. Of course, we know that nuclear testing had made lots of land unusable for agriculture or the economy. Climate action. The nuclear winter would be a climate disaster. Life below water. We know that nuclear armed or nuclear powered submarines may cause accidents and create high risks. Life on land. Again, any use would have catastrophic consequences for the environment. And finally, peace and justice and strong institutions. We know that nuclear deterrence, which is based on fear, on terror, cannot provide a sustainable peace and stability. And the right for some to terrorize the whole world is contrary to justice. So what can we conclude from this? Is that obviously arms proliferation, uncontrolled arms buildup, especially weapons of mass destruction, violate the most basic human rights, starting with the right to life. Civil society has initiated most agreements, and they have a voice to express the concerns of the people and demand the elimination of nuclear weapons. The right to peace, is not enshrined in any international treaty, but it must become an actionable human right. And those who violate this right to peace should be prosecuted internationally. So I recommend you join this initiative called Peace Humanity. And finally, there are some new areas that still lack regulation, lethal autonomous weapon systems, cyber warfare, explosive weapons in populated areas, IEDs, ballistic cruise hypersonic missiles. So there is still a lot of work to do, in partnership between civil society, humanitarian organizations, and governments. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Fenod, for such an illustrative presentation. We are afraid that while on one hand, China is actually raising its voice against the AUKUS, on the other, it is modernizing and expanding its nuclear force. And that could begin a new nuclear arms race here in Asia, requiring reinforcement of risk reduction commitments. There is perhaps a greater need to bring in certain regulations to keep the nuclear weapons of high alert status and reduce their role in military doctrines. With that view in mind, and also we are not unaware about the humanitarian consideration of nuclear weapons and its use through the 1996 advisory opinion on the use and threat of use of nuclear weapons. So with that view in mind, I would like to move on to our next speaker. Thank you, Mr. Fenod, for such illustrative presentation. So with that view in mind, we would like to move to our next speaker, Professor Francisco Taran. Sir is, when I asked for his bio while we were discussing this webinar, he gave me a very interesting bio. He told me that he's a husband, a father of 2 young men, and he's also a musician. And the other two, the one of his sons is a musician, and the other one is about to enter university. So good luck to your son, sir. And sir is a civil engineer who graduated in 1986 from Michigan Technological University. He worked until 2007 actively in Venezuela. At the same time, at night, he was a part-time teacher of mathematics, physics, English, and Spanish. He is not much into social life other than few friends and family members and neighbors. He has been for a long time a collaborator with his neighbors, and he had been fighting communism in any derivation because in his country, that is Venezuela, strong tyranny prevails due to communism since 1998, and that was originated by the socialist coalition that ruled the country in a kind of democratic way since 1958. He has helped lots of younger people through teaching basic values and inviting them to make reflection on life matters. So that's a very interesting bio, sir. We would love to hear you. Over to you, sir. Professor Francisco, are you there? Don't know. Professor Francisco, are you there? Sir might have by mistake logged out. All right, Piotr Curzon, sir, are you there? I don't think he has joined us yet. Miss Meenakshi Ganguly, have you joined, ma'am?
Yeah, I'm here.
All right, thank you so much, ma'am. Ma'am, can we see you, if that is all right? No problem. I'll just read out your bio. So till Francisco sir returns, I would like to continue with Ms. Meenakshi Ganguly. So Ms. Meenakshi Ganguly is the South Asia Director at Human Rights Watch. She oversees the organization's work in that region. Before taking over as South Asia Director in 2010, she served as Human Rights Watch's South Asia researcher since 2004. Ms. Ganguly has worked on a broad range of issues, including police reform, sexual violence, discrimination based on religion or caste, freedom of expression, and armed conflict. In India, she has researched abuses surrounding the sectarian riots in Gujarat, the lack of justice in Punjab, issues of religious freedom, the failure to protect India's vulnerable communities, including those affected areas by the Maoist conflict, and abuses related to the fightings in the states of Manipur, Jammu, and Kashmir. She has also advocated for the protection of women and children from violence, including sexual abuse, and for a human rights approach to India's foreign policy. Very interesting bio, ma'am. We are really looking forward to hear you. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry, I don't know how to put on my video. It's not coming on, so I'm afraid I will not have my video on. I do apologize for this. I just can't.
No problem, ma'am. No problem.
So thank you to the other speakers and thank you to you for inviting me. Today is Human Rights Day. It celebrates the 1948 adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I want to say, because at this point of time, human rights is often challenged by many who want to undermine them because it sometimes disagrees with their particular thought or ideology or security concern, that it is universal because at any given point of time, every individual needs their rights protected. They're free, whether it's their political rights, their economic rights, their social rights, their cultural rights, their rights to religious freedom. Each of these rights belongs to every individual. And whenever people believe that these rights of others should be undermined to promote their particular view, they should also recognize that that view, that they themselves can at another time be targeted by a reduction of their rights. So, which is why it is very important that the essential principle of human rights is not diminished. Now, the declaration came about at a time when the world was perhaps at its worst. It had come. It was at the end of a very violent Second World War. It was at the end of the only time that the world has seen exactly what the speaker before me just spoke about, the nuclear devastation that can ensue with nuclear war. That was the only time that we've seen that. It was a time when one man's persecution of minorities and his persuasive skills led to millions of people being killed, the Holocaust as we speak, which targeted people for their religion, for their ethnicity, for their sexual choices, because they were disabled, and a sort of way of purging the world of whoever he did not like or his vision did not fit in with, because he wanted his vision of perfect world. And this is important because as we go forward now, sometimes we have to remember that it's very addictive to imagine this purity, but it can lead to absolute destruction of all the basic principles of decency, morality, and human rights that holds us together. I also wanted to speak briefly about India, because this 1948 comes after the declaration comes after India gained and several other countries gained independence from colonial rule. And in India, we saw a massive devastation wrought by the partition, millions displaced, millions killed. So when we look at the world today, there are things that have certainly improved. We have, to a large part, overcome hunger. We've made tremendous gains in controlling disease. People live longer. Fewer babies and their mothers die during birth. We have technology that connects the world in ways that we could never have imagined. Just the way that we're speaking right now. Even 10 years ago, perhaps we would not have been able to imagine this. There are also democracies, more democracies than not. Some are more successful, but it is a new form of governance that a large chunk of the world has embraced. And it's an interesting idea because it does suggest that people self-select from their communities, individuals who will focus on governance, on administration, and individuals who will be bound on the basis of rules and of constitutions and of international human rights law. However, we are also seeing challenges. We found that many political leaders seem to embrace the idea of power so much that they forget that their essential job, their obligations, so to speak, to their employment, to their rules of employment. And instead, what they start to do is to abuse their power. They start to frighten people into obedience. Many of your speakers have spoken about China, and that is perhaps at one of its most terrifying outcomes when this happens, when the state decides that its role is to control people and keep them subjugated. And what it does is it immediately diminishes all the rights that the Universal Declaration provides. It takes away our right to dissent, our right to disagree, our right to life, to liberty. It is a serious challenge because many leaders seem to draw some sort of example from the Chinese experiment by saying that the discipline that it ensues can lead to economic development and progress, and that is a promise they start making to their own people. Let us curb a few rights because it will give you more jobs. It will make we hear it all the time. Your cities will turn into Shanghai. You will have more money. You will travel more. And sometimes, because unlike in China, most of these economies are most of these countries are democracies, they still have to persuade their voters. And to do that, they do a mix of also trying to create some sort of political unity by othering minority groups of various forms, ethnic minorities, religious minorities. And again, I keep focusing on the minority issue because everybody in today's global world is a minority in some context or the other. And therefore, it is very important for people to remember. And the reason this is important is eventually human rights, the guardian of human rights is the citizen, is the public. And if they do not believe in it, they will never be able to persuade states to stay within their rules of employment, so to speak. So I would like to speak a little bit about some of the challenges that we're facing today, which are new sets of challenges we've seen over the last couple of years. The challenges to our health, our security, to a future of the world, where we are likely to see some of the worst impacts of climate change. And therefore, today is a day where we need to start thinking a little bit more about collective and collaborative solutions. COVID-19 is a good example. It's endless mutations, endless times that we are trying to figure out whether we can even travel. When can we see our loved ones? Are we going to take the bug to our parents and therefore we cannot meet them? And we are losing this battle because now another mutant has arrived. And why are we losing this battle? The solution, as far as the scientists tell us, is vaccinating large parts of the world. But we've not been able to achieve that. We've not been able to achieve that because of the essential inequity that has been perpetuated by the wealthy, by wealthy governments who are hoarding, who are now talking about the booster jab, while large tracts of the world have not even had their first jab, where they are hoarding technology and refusing to share medication that is needed to help people. And I think the pandemic is a good example for every individual in this world to recognize that there are no borders, that these troubles will travel. Today it was a virus, tomorrow it will be something else. And unless we work collectively, we will not be able to solve these problems. There are also, of course, the huge amounts of problems which are linked to state policy. We've already heard a lot about China's treatment of the Uyghurs, but there's also, the drug wars that were launched in the Philippines or Bangladesh. In Myanmar, the fact that the junta has cracked down on peaceful protesters in the way that it has. The Rohingya, who are sitting on one side of India's border, while on the other side we have seen Afghanistan collapse. Now, these are all enormous challenges that require the world to work much more closely together. We're also seeing problems within the South Asian region. We see a crackdown on political opposition in Pakistan and Bangladesh. We're seeing the targeting of religious minorities in India and Sri Lanka. We're seeing the undermining of judiciary in Nepal. And we are also seeing, and this is where I perhaps disagree with one of your other speakers, the risk, because we are also finding the traditional Western societies that promoted human rights have also failed. They have failed in the most tremendous way and have enabled this new narrative of double standards, of and it is harming the human rights movement. It is harming the protection of citizens. So one of the most crucial examples playing out now is the refugee crisis in Europe. And if Europe closes its border, a much wealthier Europe starts closing its borders, how do we expect that Bangladesh is going to hold up its responsibilities towards protecting 1 million Rohingya refugees? Bangladesh is a much poorer economy. We have seen the crimes that NATO forces committed in Afghanistan. We have seen the terrible torture by US special forces in Iraq. And these are things that have undermined the responses of law enforcement in all parts of the world, because it has also undermined the capacity of the US and other Western democracies to promote human rights in the way they should, because they let their standards slip. So it is important now, again, as I said, for collective action, for each one to be responsible for holding up the basic principles of the Universal Declaration. If we don't do that, if we ignore these abuses, unfortunately, what we are going to end up with is more crisis. And in that, as I keep saying, because I keep calling for collective action, is because, of course, we work on India, and where India should be speaking for human rights, not only at home. We like the principle of the UN Human Rights Council because it does put that responsibility on every state to hold up to the basic. They doesn't mean that the essential responsibility does not exist. And by claiming sovereignty, by protecting abusive governments because it is a strategic interest or trading interest, is going to eventually lead to people suffering. It is going to then risk another cycle of violence, and we have witnessed way too many in the world. Embracing a sort of checkbook diplomacy, like that China seems to like, is also not going to help because it's propping up extremely abusive governments, including in Myanmar right now. So I would end with saying that Human Rights Day 2021 should not still be a day where we lament the losses of fears of what may, or lament the losses of fear what may come. It should be a call to action. It should be a reminder that there were hard-won battles that were fought, and those gains must be protected and advanced, and that we cannot lose the essential principle of the Declaration of Human Rights, which is what we are celebrating today, which is that human rights is for.
Thank you, ma'am, for your comprehensive presentation on human rights and its violations across the world. I think each and every country across the world should unite, as in forgetting their domestic differences, their trivial issues. They should unite and rather start speaking about human rights in totality. So with this view in mind, ma'am, we want to move on to Professor Francisco. I think sir is back. Sir, are you there, sir? Francisco, sir, are you there? Can you kindly unmute? I think sir is having a problem to unmute the mic. Sir, Professor Francisco, are you there? He is there, but I think, sir, since it is his first time, sir is not being able to. All right, we will try to make him unmute the mic. With that view in mind, I would like to proceed to Piotr Kurzin. Are you there? Did you, let the speakers know that if you guys want to talk to each other on any issues, or if you want to share your views on any, your opinions on each other's presentations, you might do so. And after that, we might move on to the question and answer round. And for the question and answer round, I would request all the audiences here to kindly type your questions in the chat box, or to raise your hand or unmute your mic and pose your question with the name of the speaker to whom it is intended to. All right, so I'll give the next few minutes for the speakers, for our eminent speakers, to talk amongst themselves if you have any points to make about each other's presentation. And after that, as we are done after that, then we will move on to the question and answer round. Thank you. So whom do I start with? Dr. Nagao, do you have any feedback or anything to ask to any other eminent speaker in the panel?
Yeah, thank you very much for giving a chance to speak. Yes, I'm focusing on how to deal with China. Of course, how to respect human rights is the most important issue in this seminar, and that is important, I think. But at the same time, Japan is facing threat from China, and China has many human rights issues, and so how to deal with China is maybe dominated our way of thinking. That's also true too. So currently, many countries checking the meaning of the diplomatic boycott. So I want to hear the opinion of diplomatic boycott of the Olympic in Beijing. What do you think is a question to the other speakers? Is this I think this is a proper topic to talk, I think.
Yeah, I'll give you my initial reaction is I feel very strongly about this. It's utterly insufficient. It does not rise to the magnitude of crime that is being committed here. And as I tried to say in my opening presentation, the punitive measures against China's Communist Party should be the second focus, not the first focus. The first focus needs to be to end the genocide. If the position is we're moving right into the punitive phase, we're sort of foregoing or overlooking or discarding that there's any potential for us to have any leverage, when in fact, for all of this reference of international law, which is one of my grave concerns, frankly, regarding the broad human rights community, is that there's, you know, a kind of moral equivalency among nations. It's the ultimate hypocrite on most of these issues. You know, I mean, for it to be speaking out on the environment far and away and getting worse, or to be speaking out on women's rights and human rights when it's, you know, atrocious record is almost unmatched in the world. And to be speaking about globalism and international cooperation while they're simultaneously keeping out inspectors on the two biggest issues we have right now, this genocide and the origins of the pandemic, and lying to the world about it. So, and of course, simultaneously, they've gotten more and more influential within the UN and within the Human Rights Council. So, in my judgment, I am really, I have to say, I'm incredibly disappointed in the way that this has been managed. I give some credit to the Trump administration for at least issuing that designation and report in January of this year. But we're now, like, as I said, going on a year into this, and there's been no tangible ramification to the CCP for this, and not nearly. And where's the UN, by the way? I mean, for all of the dialogue that we have about this, I mean, where's the UN's forcefulness in demanding entry into these camps? I mean, the UN is completely missing on this. They have not yet, well, they've issued some vague statements, really dived into the magnitude of this atrocity. And that's why I said, I mean, sadly, I mean, you cannot rely on a body that is comprised. I mean, the moral standard that you're carrying as a democracy, as a free nation with rule of law, even whatever flaws exist in the United States and the West that you can point to, the structure that allows for some degree of moral high ground on these issues. You simply cannot be relying on you know, ambassadors from these tyrannies to do anything more than operate in self-interest. And I think that's sadly what we got out of this. And as much as I believe in the UN, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and it's appropriate every year for us to take this time and to really reinforce its relevance, look at some of the signatories to this: China, Iran, Cuba, Syria, Turkey, Venezuela. These are some of the worst, atrocious violators of human rights in the world. So quite honestly, you cannot be intellectually serious and say, yeah, this Universal Declaration has broad, you know, ramifications and is making the world a better place, when its very signatories have been violators of every one of these commitments. So let me just say one final point on the issue of nuclear arms. It would be better, I believe, if there were no nuclear weapons in the world. If there weren't, we have less anxiety about these issues. But to say that nuclear weapons in the hands of any country are, you know, if I took that presentation literally and said, well, based on it, the US should single-handedly, universally disarm itself, we would make the world an incredibly more dangerous place. We would inherently strengthen the atrocious and aggressive forces that we're condemning today. And indeed, the greatest threats to stability and peace and security in this world including World War II and including the Cold War, ended only because the US maintained a formidable conventional and ultimately nuclear capability. In the absence of nuclear weapons in Western Europe, there's no doubt there would have been an invasion by the Warsaw Pact. So, you know, we have to sort of also deal with the reality that these weapons exist, also deal with the reality that Russia, China, been consistent violators. They sign these agreements, they violate every single one of them. There's no real recourse available. And the limitations that the US to really enforce these things are becoming, I think, pretty. And I certainly have seen that with the pandemic and not getting into Wuhan and WHO, all these multinational organizations really, you know, are only as strong as their member states are. And when their member states are kind of at the core of the problem, those institutions inevitably are compromised as well. But I believe that when you have the word genocide, just to answer your question, when the word genocide is brought up, I'm having a debate over whether we should participate in these Olympics and at what level. We ourselves are contributing to the devaluation of Uyghur lives. I don't particularly have any strong opinion about it. I don't think it worked in 1980 when we boycotted the Soviet Olympics over their invasion of Afghanistan. We drove the Soviets out because we armed the Mujahideen. Otherwise, they would never have left. They didn't. The boycott of the Olympics was just an act of symbolism. I would prefer to not even be talking about the Olympics, and I would have no objection, frankly, if we participated completely in them. And certainly, the athletes put their whole lives into this, and shouldn't be held, you know, to have to pay the price for what's actually developed here. When we have so many options that we could be moving on right now as it relates to particularly insisting on these the breakup of these camps. And if they're not, and if the answer from Xi Jinping is no, you're not coming in, I'm sorry, at that point you've forfeited any degree. I believe he already has forfeited it, but that would solidify it, I think, in the minds of all, that not only is he engaged in genocide, but he's not an individual who's really prepared to be viewed as anything less than a tyrant on the global scene. Should be kicked out of the UN. This is not an issue of whether they should be, you know, involved in the Human Rights Council. I'm not sure they should be a member of the UN. And these signatories, I realize this is the UN Universal Declaration is not an enforceable document. It's important to continue to recognize that. It's an affirmation of aspirations of these governments in a lot of ways, and these governments have undergone changes, mostly on the negative. My final point is, I think I heard earlier that democracy was on the rise. Absolutely not on the rise around the world. Documentably, and you can, this is, you know, there by the State Department and thereby Freedom House has a great record, 20 years of steady diminishment of legitimate democratically governed countries around the world, in 20 consecutive years of that happening. So this idea that the end of the Cold War would be what Francis Fukuyama called the end of history in that famous National Interest article, it's been anything but that. I mean, we've had enormous conflicts, enormous threats with new threats that have emerged. And, you know, history is absolutely continuing in the spirit of history, which is, you know, unfortunately and saddeningly been, you know, has focused on many of these conflicts between differing ideologies and different views of what the future of the world has. And that's why I think this conflict with the CCP is enormously important, because at, you know, in the next century and even shorter periods of time than that, perhaps even in our own lives, you know, the march of one of these systems or the other, you know, we're either going to capitulate to this vision that they have regarding a socialist and communist run world, essentially from Beijing, which is a big part of their vision, or we're going to stand up to it. And this, I believe, wholly unpopular regime is going to disintegrate like the former Soviet Union did in ways that could be enormously constructive for all of the world. But to just sit around and wait for one of these things to happen is not an option. It's time for us to take a stand on where we are on these things. And I guess what I'm suggesting is this Uyghur genocide is one of the first major tests of what sort of fortitude we have. And if you had to grade how we're doing on it, including among how human rights organizations are doing on it, they're failing. And I'll also say, I think, as we rely a lot on these human rights organizations, U.S., Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, Freedom House. I don't know why it is, but they're not working with conservatives, not working with Republicans. We don't hear from them on these issues, and that's over half the electorate. And it's also I think, conservatives and Republicans in the 21st century are more focused on these issues right now. They're natural allies on human rights matters. And that's one operational takeaway, I believe, that could be improved for all of the outreach resources that these large global organizations have. I'll tell you from a high level that very few identifiable conservatives ever hear from them as it relates to working in partnership. And I'll speak for myself, but I think it's true of many others of my colleagues who look at it and say, well, naturally would align with you on many of these issues. Just one final point is to say, if we made foreign policy only about human rights, things can go negatively. I reminded, and I think we should be reminded, say, the Carter administration, and the way it, looked at the Shah, looked at Somoza in Nicaragua, and concluded, that there were very imperfect human rights conditions in both countries. But what happened? Carter responded. He put on these, huge sanctions on both, undermined both countries, and undermined the Shah, undermined Somoza, both clearly flawed individuals, but aligned with the Western world. And they were replaced with the Ayatollah and the Sandinistas and Ortega that were not only worse abusers of human rights, but were emerged as major enemies of Western democracy. And in the case of the Islamic regime in Iran, one of the great the largest state-sponsored terrorism in the world. It did not, as a matter of natural origin, need to come into power. We put it in power when we made that decision to undermine the Shah. So, one thing about regime change that's always very dangerous, I think we saw it in Iraq too, is that you need to ponder for all the imperfections that exist in any government around the world, that as bad as it may look at any given moment, things could actually be worse. And that's why I believe in the proactive steps that we took. You probably heard in my intro, I'd worked with an NGO that had done a lot of support for the building of civil society and democracies. That approach works, but ultimately, this is one of the great questions that I think we confront, and I don't think it's one that we clearly have answered. This anniversary today is what we do in the way of getting non-compliant countries to abide by standards that they're not naturally inclined to abide by. Ultimately, I guess I come back to my primary point, is that the force and strength of Western democracies who embrace these values, we become more able to influence the world in that direction with strength than we would with weakness. And so it's also an issue of recognizing that a strong America, I think increasingly a strong India, strong EU, strong free nation, this is in the global interest to see not just that these countries are strong, but that they're united and working collaboratively in ways that perhaps multinational organizations that comprise regimes that don't subscribe to these views, really can't do. Hope that answers your question. Probably that and then some.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, we are not acting with the magnitude of. We need to be acting with urgency.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. Would Mr. Fenod like to comment or like to give a feedback or reply to John, sir, on whatever you have said?
Yes, thank you. Just, briefly, of course, I'll try to speak as an objective researcher using scientific approaches, not ideology or religious preferences, which may influence the veracity of analysis. Of course, I'm not I don't have any sympathy for the Chinese communist regime, and we can see, how much human rights violation they are responsible for. But if we only look at arms proliferation, we have to be again, use the facts, the objective arsenals, its increase of nuclear weapons, etc. One figure was actually mentioned by a U.S. official or military official, saying that it is expected that China will double its the number of its nuclear weapons. Now, of course, this is not based on again any evidence, but if after that doubling, China will have still 10% of the number of nuclear weapons owned by the United States, which is about the same owned by Russia, and for a population which is 4 times that of the United States, of course. So again, it's all a matter of proportion. The US is the main military spender, spends more than the next 15 countries, including Russia, China, France, UK, Japan, Australia, etc. 40% of global military spending, 40% of production of weapons, export of weapons, and being the first military country in the world. Look at history. It has, since the Second World War, it has actually lost all its wars, and probably because the military approach to militarism is not the best solution, especially now when you deal with very complex. It's true that obviously there's a lot to do, and I'll be less skeptical about the role that the UN or the international community can play, especially if you have this partnership between civil society organizations like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, because they help actually reveal the information, spread the information, and then help government or put pressure on governments to act and to do things. And it's we have a wonderful international criminal court which has actually prosecuted individuals for war crimes or crimes against humanity. And it's a pity that the United States still remains outside of this convention and international court, because that if that was different, then perhaps the US would have more influence and more power to prosecute these war crimes or crimes against humanity.
Ask you, Mark. I mean, we can't obviously control what China does with its nuclear armaments. It's obviously. I think you're right on target as far as what you said about them upping their nuclear capabilities, but we can control what the United States does. If in the sort of what appears to be your ideal world, I mean, if we unilaterally got rid of our nuclear capabilities and diminished considerably or fully our defense and other conventional armaments, you feel human rights in the world would be improved or it would be diminished?
No, certainly they would be improved because, again, nobody's asking.
You don't believe that the tyrannical regimes of the world, Russia, China, who would remain fully nuclear armed, they would not take advantage of our weakness. Because I think that shows an incredible naivete about the divide between free nations and totalitarian ones. And it's been proven throughout history, from Munich onward, that it doesn't work. And that's kind of my concern with sort of the intellectual processing of national security in other contexts, like in a human rights context. So, the Cold War certainly would never have ended without our capabilities. It's untrue to say that we've not won a war since World War II. The Cold War was one of the most significant in the history of the world. And we fortunately have not had, aside from Iraq and Afghanistan, really any other direct engagement. And I wouldn't even say, you can say, well, we lost, I don't know if we lost Afghanistan. I mean, the goal of Afghanistan was to get rid of Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda predominantly. And we did get rid of Osama bin Laden. And we did get rid of Al-Qaeda, who now are probably making a return, but those objectives were fulfilled. Iraq, in retrospect, was an error. I don't believe it served a higher purpose, but you cannot deny that Trump was enormously successful in taking out almost all of ISIS throughout Syria and Iraq. That clearly was a conflict that was won. So I guess I can't intellectually process how the world would be a better place with a weak United States militarily and all of these tyrannical regimes, one of whom is definitionally genocidal, that with a straight face you can say that human rights would be advanced in that context. I think that's one of the most dangerous messages to be sending on a day when we celebrate free nations and this ongoing conflict between those who do and do not respect human rights and human liberties.
I think we could go on for a long time. I think we have to agree that we disagree on the basic premises, which
well, just explain to me how it would work. I mean, I'm not looking to.
Yes, I didn't interrupt you. So let me just look at the facts, not the ideology. No one is asking any country to disarm unilaterally. We have a whole history of arms control agreements, which were most of the time initiated or supported by the United Nations, which led, or the United States, which led to actual reduction of nuclear catastrophe. Again, if you claim that the peace was maintained thanks to the United States nuclear weapons, well, it's just like believing in that Jesus walked on the waters. You have no scientific evidence to sustain that. There could be many other reasons why the Cold War ended without a nuclear war. And so you continue to have this belief, but again, it's not a very scientific, very objective approach.
Oh, I think it's indisputable. I mean, even among the former Soviet Union defense officials, it's indisputable. Take something more contemporary. Let's talk about what China's Communist Party is doing in the South China Sea. Let's assume that we took your guidance on that and the U.S. suspended completely our naval activities in the region, other free nations, sort of outcome.
May I please come in a little? Actually, Michael sir and Mark sir, That was a great debate that was going on, and it was really very enlightening for all the participants, the students and the audiences over here. But unfortunately, the clock isn't waiting and we are almost cross 6:30, 13 minutes ahead. So it was a very interesting debate. We have so much to learn from you both. We have to agree that we might disagree, but at the same time, we are all trying to save humanity. So that is our common goal. With disarmament or not, we are trying to save humanity. So that is our common goal. Both of you were wonderful in your presentations, and I really enjoyed, learning the two sides of the same story. It's very nice. But then, unfortunately, we will have to, end it here today because we do not have time for the question and answer round as well. But it was excellent to have both your dignitaries on the board and also Dr. Nagao. And unfortunately, Francisco sir couldn't make it. I'm so sorry for him. He's a very, very nice human being. I have been interacting with him for quite a number of days, but he couldn't make it to the technicalities, and he's not quite a wizard that he told me right now. But unfortunately, we have to end it here. So thank you so much. And Meenakshi ma'am probably has left because she had to go somewhere else because she's from the Human Rights Watch and today is the International Human Rights Day. We will like to have a cup of coffee and a cup of tea over such a debate in the near future if both you dignitaries agree to come over and join the table with us once again. It was loving. It was such a loving discussion, and we loved to have you. So I would now request Ms. Arshibu give the formal vote of thanks to all the dignitaries, the speakers, and the audiences. Over to you, Arshi, if you're there.
Yes, I'm here. Thanks, Ryoshi. Good evening and greetings, our esteemed guests of today on the Human Rights Day, respected founder and director, Sir Mr. Abhishek Ranjan. It's my privilege to have been asked to propose a vote of thanks on behalf of Red Lantern Analytica and the entire team. And I am extending this on my behalf and on the team's behalf a very hearty thanks to all of you for your participation. Thanks to all speakers for gracing your important work and sharing with us your expanded opinions and debates. We disagree to agree at some point, so that's all appreciated, and we must work collectively. It has been always a great pleasure to be able to understand and learn so much about the importance of human rights and its uplifting values that it carries along. And we are extremely grateful to you all for touching on the subject of human rights today and global peace. So through the excellent interaction that we have had between our guest and the moderator, it always creates immense awareness amongst all the new learners that we are having and inspiring researchers in the field of human rights and its connecting fields. It would be our pleasure to invite you over and over again and to keep discussing this the diverse components that human rights today carry in near future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, all the loving people over here. With your due permission, can I please ask everybody to log off and end the meeting? Thank you. Thank you. Please stay connected. Please stay. Thank you. Thank you, Mark sir. Thank you, Michael sir. Thank you, Nagao sir. Please stay connected. Thank you, Francisco sir, Piotr sir, Meenakshi ma'am. They are not here. And thank you all the wonderful audiences. Without your support, we would not have been able to accomplish this mission. Thank you.